Part of today's conference. We will have now the keynote speech by Father David Hollenbach, who is the Pedro Arrupe Scholar, distinguished scholar at the World School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Father Hollenbach has been my thesis director. He's a dear friend, and he has spent his life working on human rights and issues around forced migration. He has also taught in Africa for many years at Hekima University College in Nairobi, and he has collaborated in various ways with the Jesuit Refugee Service. So just to add a little footnote, you're welcome to stay also after there is some drinks to chat. There are some of the tables, there is material which you can take with you, especially from the dossier from EDOS and so on. There's only one table, which is the Gregorian and Biblical Press, where the volumes are for sale. So you're welcome to help yourself to the other books which you find in the atrium. So, without much ado, let's hear the keynote by Father David Hollenbach.
Thank you very much, Father McAuliffe. It is a pleasure to be with you at this conference at the Gregorian, and I am most grateful to have been invited to present to you today. I would like to advance my understanding of how the religious community should respond to modern slavery by saying that, in my view, the response should be one marked by both strength and humility. Strength of spirit is surely needed, for the realities of modern slavery can tempt one to despair over the abuse of human beings that we continue to inflict upon one another. I will speak as a Catholic Christian, as a Jesuit priest, since that is my identity, but I hope that what I say will be relevant to other religious communities as well. In the face of the possible discouragement that we face in relation to modern slavery, strength of heart is surely needed if we're going to take the vigorous action required to overcome the abuses of modern slavery and trafficking and other forms of abuse, such as forced labor, that we have heard about earlier today. At the same time, I will argue that humility is certainly needed in the churches and the Christian community's response to the reality of modern slavery, because slavery has been traditionally and religiously and morally legitimated by both the Christian community and a number of other religious communities around the world over the centuries. Strength is needed, and the strength that is needed will certainly arise in part from the vision of the dignity of the human person that should shape our lives as human beings and certainly shape our lives as Christians. Modern slavery, all forms of it, are severe violations of humanity and of the dignity of the person, of those who are subjected to it. Those who are enslaved are treated as less than human, not only through material, physical, and economic harms that they face, but also through the psychological and spiritual wounds that being treated the way they are inflicts upon them. Such treatment violates the insistence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the, quote, inherent dignity and equal inalienable rights of all members of the human family must be fully recognized. It also, this treatment, violates the Bible's proclamation in the book of Genesis that God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Thus, every human being possesses a sacredness and a dignity that requires respect and social support. Such dignity and respect is denied when people are subjected to modern slavery. Thus, the Second Vatican Council strongly condemned whatever violates the integrity of the person, whatever insults human dignity, such as, and these are characteristics that seem to be present in modern slavery, such as prostitution, the selling of women and children, disgraceful working conditions, enslavement. All of these, wherever people are treated in this way, they are harmed and human society is poisoned. And it says these practices, the Second Vatican Council says, these practices do as much harm to those who practice them as to those who suffer them. So they are supreme dishonor in addition to the Creator, to God. These practices, therefore, are among those that we see today as forms of modern slavery, as we have heard earlier today. They are moral offenses because they gravely violate the dignity of the person and his or her fundamental rights. The Church today, therefore, joins numerous other religious and secular agencies in calling for a halt to modern slavery, to forced labor, to trafficking in persons for work, for sex, or for organs, and for an end to all similar abuses. Therefore, both human rights and a biblical understanding of the person imply that modern slavery brings trauma to persons who are subjected to it and to the communities who are affected by it. Thus, in his 1993 encyclical, Veritatis Splendor, Pope John Paul II called these abuses intrinsically evil. In Pope John Paul II's words, such actions are by their nature incapable of being ordered to God because they radically contradict the good of the person made in God's image. They are wrong always and everywhere, quite apart from the intentions or circumstances in which they occur. Thus, both the Second Vatican Council and Pope John Paul II insist that human trafficking, forced labor, and other slavery-like practices are objectively evil. To treat people in ways that we today call modern slavery is a moral abuse to their dignity as persons. It is a wrong that Christians and other religious believers should always avoid. The Christian community, therefore, should work vigorously to seek the abolition of slavery, abolition of modern slavery through corporate action and strong teaching. Achieving this abolition will call for carefully developed pastoral strategies that work to overcome the social and political conditions that support this abusive treatment of persons. It will require vigorous efforts to transform the misguided value systems that regrettably lead some people to engage in these harmful activities. Strong commitment by religious and church members and pastoral leaders will be required, especially to resist the opposition to change that is almost certain to arise. So, a strong response coming from the Christian community and the religious community at large. I would argue, though, that in addition to such strong commitment, individual Christians and the Christian community will also need genuine humility in its efforts to overcome modern slavery. The need for humility is evident when we recall that despite Pope John Paul II's insistence that slavery is always and everywhere wrong, the Christian community and church leaders not only taught for many, many centuries that slavery could be morally acceptable, but actually practiced it. There is an obvious contradiction between contemporary rejection in church teachings of slavery and modern slavery and the history of the Christian community's practice regarding slavery. We must keep this contradiction in mind as we reflect upon how the Christian community should respond to the realities of modern slavery today. The distinguished historian of Christian and especially Catholic moral and legal thought, John T. Noonan, has studied the way that the church has dealt with slavery through its long history. He shows that despite the fact that the church now sees enslavement as a grave moral deviation, and indeed as always and everywhere evil, through most of its history, the Catholic Church supported the enslavement of some persons by others as morally legitimate. Noonan's reflections, I think, can help in our development of the Christian and church response to the realities of modern slavery today and to develop an adequate response. From St. Paul, Noonan points through St. Augustine down to the American bishops in the 1800s, chattel slavery was seen as an institution that the Christian community did not need to challenge. In fact, this institution was supported and slavery was practiced by the Catholic community and by institutional leaders. This past history is particularly distressing to me as a Jesuit priest teaching at Georgetown University. In 2015, Georgetown University, the institution where I teach, has been engaged in serious reflection on the fact that through much of its history, the university held many persons in the bondage of slavery and supported institutions of human enslavement. The founder of Georgetown University, John Carroll, who also became the first bishop of the United States, himself owned slaves. The priests who ran Georgetown University owned sizable numbers of slaves who worked on the plantations that supported Jesuit churches and Jesuit schools in Maryland. Due to financial pressures, in 1838, these priests sold 272 enslaved men, women, and children to another Catholic slave owner and shipped them from Washington, D.C., where the Georgetown University is located, to another Catholic slave owner in Louisiana, 1,000 miles south of Washington, sometimes breaking up families when they did so. The sale of these people has become the focus of reflection on the historical relation of Catholicism to slavery at my university and more broadly in the Catholic community in the United States. This reflection shows how great a distance there has been between the moral perceptions of earlier Catholics, including earlier Jesuits in the United States, and the proclamations of Pope John Paul II and of the Second Vatican Council that the enslavement of human beings is intrinsically evil and a supreme dishonor to the Creator. This history, it seems to me, should lead Christians to recognize that their ancestors, our ancestors, in fact suffered from a kind of moral blindness. The books of the Old and New Testament, many Catholic theologians, official church teachings even, saw slavery as at least tolerable because their moral vision had been too much shaped by the experience of their surrounding cultures. John Noonan has shown, however, that new experiences led Christians to come to recognize the devastating impact of human slavery. New experience enabled the Christian community to discover the implications of its faith in Jesus Christ, to which it had formerly been blind. This new awareness was awakened by the protests and the resistance of the slaves themselves. By having to face this resistance in their actual experience, Christians of former ages were led to a new understanding of what their faith in Jesus Christ required. This awakening generated the abolitionist movements that produced the cultural and legal norms that today declare chattel slavery morally and legally unacceptable. They offer only after much conflict with the surrounding culture and argument about the relation between Christian tradition and that surrounding culture did the implications of faith in Jesus Christ or response to slavery become really clear. John Noonan fully agrees that the story of Jesus Christ presented us in the New Testament is definitively normative for Christian ethics. But he argues that it is evident from the case of slavery alone that it has taken time to ascertain what the demands of Jesus Christ really are. It took centuries for both the human community and the Christian community to awaken to the deep harms caused to the dignity of persons by chattel slavery. Christians came to a new, deepened understanding of the meaning of the Bible proclamation that all humans are created in the image of God and are loved by God. It took a long time for Christians to awaken to what that meant. And this interaction led the long-held traditions that legitimated slavery to interact with new experience generated by the movements of the time to lead to today's unambiguous moral and legal rejections of chattel slavery. So, what does this dramatic history tell us about how religious communities and the church itself should address the realities of modern slavery today? First, in my view, humility should mark all Christian and religious responses and efforts to overcome modern enslavement. The Christian community should humbly admit its failures on chattel slavery through much of its history. Second, efforts against modern slavery will be effective when they rise from carefully listening to the experience of those suffering the harm of modern slavery, just as the awakening to the reality of what was being done to people through chattel slavery in traditional periods came through listening to the experience of slaves themselves. Our listening to the experience of people who are suffering from modern slavery should be at the root of how we try to respond. A recent study of diverse styles of Christian engagement in the public square by the distinguished scholar Kathleen Caveney shows that the rhetorical style she calls prophetic denunciation is not always the most effective way to mobilize people against genuine evils. Now, of course, the abolitionist movement against chattel slavery rightly denounced that chattel slavery in forceful and prophetic ways. But Caveney argues that when prophetic denunciation is the sole mode of discourse in opposing certain things that are seen as evil, it can sometimes produce backlash due to resentment against what is seen and sometimes seen as self-righteousness. When this happens, change becomes less likely. Change is more likely when it is advocated with a humility that avoids self-righteousness. In support of this conclusion, Kathleen Caveney cites Abraham Lincoln's leadership in overcoming slavery in the United States. Lincoln clearly believed that slavery was a moral evil that had to be abolished, but he advocated this change in a way that also humbly acknowledged that those on both sides of the American Civil War were sinners with imperfect knowledge of the morally right path that lay ahead. Lincoln called for the United States to complete the elimination of slavery with humble words that called for reconciliation. He called for those on both sides of the destructive conflict over slavery that led to the Civil War to approach this with modesty. In his words, they should approach it with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. In this way, let us strive to finish the work of abolishing slavery. Therefore, I conclude that Christians who work against trafficking and modern slavery should have a kind of moral humility to admit the Christian community's failure that has marked its approach to slavery in the past. Without such humility, self-righteousness, and even hypocrisy might undermine Christian efforts. Intellectual humility will also be needed because Christians need deeper understanding of what needs to be done that will come from carefully listening to the stories of those affected by modern slavery. Such listening will enable believers to acknowledge that they do not have error-free insight about public policies that will be most effective. And social humility will enable the Christian community to collaborate in the struggle with those outside the Christian community and indeed those outside the religious community. Let me draw one final suggestion on how we might approach modern slavery that is drawn from my experience of some contact with the Jesuit Refugee Service and how it seeks to respond to the needs of refugees today. The ministry of the Jesuit Refugee Service to displaced people has three dimensions in its official proclamation: accompaniment, service, and advocacy. Accompaniment means being on the ground with the people being served, listening closely to their stories, enabling them to speak for themselves about their struggles, and helping them recognize that other human beings take them seriously as human. Accompaniment shows the displaced that they are not alone and they are not forced to rely just on their own resources. Some refugees have said that such accompaniment, when it's carried out by the Jesuit Refugee Service staff, has been the most important help they have received in their struggles. Accompaniment also, though, has significant effects on those who provide help to the displaced people. It enables the Jesuit refugee staff, for example, to come to a deeper awareness of both the needs of those they seek to assist and also to the refugees' capacity to help themselves through their own agency, enabling people who are displaced and who are suffering to take action themselves with the support of the serving community. An accompaniment of those who are displaced also enables the staff of Jesuit Refugee Service to see more accurately what policies are likely to be more effective. It enables the staff to avoid the errors that arise from presupposing that because they're well educated and come from the West, for example, they already know what should be done. Listening leads to learning what has been effective in the past and what is likely to be effective in the future. Humble accompaniment, then, can lead Jesuit Refugee Service workers to better service. And it requires a humble readiness to learn from those who one seeks to aid. Such learning will also strengthen the service being provided and lead to more effective advocacy on behalf of those one seeks to help. I would conclude, therefore, that accompaniment that enables those facing modern forms of slavery to speak for themselves may well be the most effective beginning place for the assistance that the religious community seeks to provide in the movement against modern slavery today. The service and advocacy on behalf of those facing modern slavery provided by the religious community can lead to a strong form of service and a more adequate kind of advocacy. I would hope that these reflections can provide some assistance as we continue our reflection on the realities of modern slavery today. Thank you very much.